The Prime Minister on indulgence.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Small Business will be absent from question time today as he is representing Australia at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank annual meeting of the Board of Governors in the Republic of Korea, and the Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf.
Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, for the first time in Australia's history, gross debt will crash through $500 billion. So how can the Prime Minister possibly justify giving millionaires
the Opposition
a tax
will resume
cut?
his seat. Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection will not interject loudly as questions are asked, or for that matter any time. I'm cautioning him right now at the start of question time. I cannot hear the question. The Leader of the Opposition, that includes those. The member for Dawson is warned. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, for the first time in Australia's history, gross debt will crash through $500 billion. So how can the Prime Minister possibly justify giving millionaires a $16,400 tax cut in just 16 days' time?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, few people are less qualified to give lectures on debt than the Leader of the Opposition. He went to an election. And he promised more debt. More debt, $16.5 billion of more debt. Not content with leaving the coalition with unsustainable spending, and then in opposition opposing every attempt, or almost every attempt, to rein it back. He then goes into an election campaign and says we'll have higher taxes, higher spending, and we'll have more debt. He'll have more debt. And now he appears to be surprised, shocked and surprised, he is, Mr Speaker, by the fact that debt is growing. Well, Mr Speaker, what's his plan for it? More debt? More debt. That's what the Leader of the Opposition says. No doubt he's concerned that the debt isn't growing fast enough, because everything he did was to make it grow. He added to the debt, and he went to an election.
The
Mr
member for
Speaker,
Parramatta is warned.
he opposed the company tax cut, and he spent all the proceeds. He spent all the proceeds. Now, we have seen today great figures in terms of job growth. What's driving that, Mr Speaker? It's investment. It's confidence. It's firms hiring Australians to get to work, to build their businesses. And that is being encouraged by our company tax cuts. The Labor Party opposes all of that. They oppose that growth. They sneer at jobs and growth. Just a slogan, they say. Well, I'll tell you what, Mr Speaker, it's an outcome. It's an outcome. That's what we're seeing. It's what my government is delivering. And what Labor delivered was unsustainable debt. Mr Speaker, we continue to clean up the mess Labor left us. And the Leader of the Opposition, fresh from the drawing rooms of Tarak and Sandringham, fresh from tucking his knees under the table of all his rich mates, fresh from selling out the members of the AWU, selling out their penalty rates, fresh, glowing in hypocrisy as this champion of the poor and oppressed. He then complains about tax cuts for millionaires. Well, is that anyone who earns over $180,000 is a millionaire? Is that right? Wasn't so long ago he said on Melbourne radio, people who earn over $180,000 are middle income. They're the people he wants to keep on taxing. They're the people he wants to keep on taxing. He has no plan for jobs, no plan for growth, just higher taxes, more debt, less investment, less employment.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the steps the government is taking to ensure that residents seeking to become Australian citizens share our values of freedom, equality and mutual respect, including in my electorate of Bonna?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, we are the most successful multicultural society in the world. It is a remarkable achievement of which every Australian can be proud. It has been built on an orderly and stable migration program over many years, over generations. And Mr Speaker, we have seen what happens in other countries where migration is not controlled. We have seen literally in Europe existential threats to nation-states, to their political stability, to their harmony. We have seen uncontrolled and irregular migration flows threaten the very existence of nations in the world today. Now, we have restored the integrity of our borders. There has not been a successful people smuggling operation coming to Australia or seeking to come to Australia for over 1,000 days. And we have a migration program that has the people's confidence because they know that their government and their government alone determine who comes to Australia. Now, what unites us as Australians, Mr Speaker, is our commitment to shared values: democracy, freedom, the rule of law, mutual respect, equal rights for men and women. Fundamental Australian values which are acceptable to everybody, regardless of their religion, regardless of their ethnic background. So we should be reinforcing that. And we make no apologies for ensuring that those who seek to join our Australian family are committed to the values that define us and which unite us. So early today, the Minister introduced legislation to put Australian values at the heart of our citizenship process. It's something that should be welcomed by everyone in this chamber. And yet the opposition has failed to support this principle. They're unable to support strengthened English language requirements. In fact, I heard the member for Watson criticising that on the radio this morning. They're unable to support the need to demonstrate integration into the Australian community. They're unable to support a requirement to commit to our values and pledge allegiance to Australia. The Labor Party, Mr Speaker, has failed to learn from its mistakes. They're divided on the need for strong borders and on the need for an orderly immigration system. 10 Labor members and senators have publicly questioned the need for our citizenship changes, while the member for Watson, a former immigration minister no less, has again questioned whether a strong immigration and citizenship policy is important for security. Mr Speaker, nothing is more important to secure our future than maintaining our successful multicultural nation, united by a commitment to our Australian values.
The member for McMahon has the
Thanks,
call.
Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, for the first time in Australia's history, gross debt will crash through $500 billion. Wow. So how can the Prime Minister possibly justify giving big business a $65 billion tax cut?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Shadow Treasurer is concerned about the level of debt in this country, he should apologise. He should apologise. He should apologise with all of the spivs on that side of the chamber, Mr Speaker, who over so many years racked up the debt in this country and set fire to the nation's finances, Mr Speaker. What this government inherited from those opposite when it came to debt was gross debt increasing at a rate of 33.9% average per year. You know what the debt would be today, Mr Speaker, in the budget for 17-18 if we had carried on Labor's reckless spending approach to debt? You know, it wouldn't be $500 billion, Mr Speaker. It would be $1 trillion, Mr Speaker. $1 trillion if we had not taken the decision to take that average rate of growth in debt that occurred under the Labor Party and reduced it down to now less than 10% a year, Mr Speaker. And the other difference between those on that side of the House, the Labor Party, on this side of the House, is what did they raise that debt for? How did they rack up all of that expenditure, Mr Speaker? It wasn't just that they couldn't control their expenditure, and their expenditure grew at twice the rate, Mr Speaker, than has occurred under this government. But what did they spend it on? Overpriced school halls, Mr Speaker, setting fire to people's roofs, Mr Speaker, with their pink bats program. Mr Speaker, they sent it out in cheques to dead people and pets, Mr Speaker, with their cash splash. On top of that, there was around $12 billion in blowouts on border protection that the Shadow Treasurer was more responsible for than any other minister in the previous government. But plenty of them had a good go at it, Mr Speaker. So when it comes to this side of the House, what are we investing in over the next 10 years? From 2018-19, this will be the first time, Mr Speaker, that we are issuing Commonwealth Government securities not to pay for everyday expenses. What they did, Mr Speaker, they borrowed to pay for the grocery bill, not to build a house and buy a house, Mr Speaker. We invest what we're now doing in raising the gross debt, Mr Speaker, to build airports, to build railways, to build infrastructure, to build submarines, Mr Speaker, the ones that they wouldn't build, Mr Speaker, to build the things that are going to grow our economy. And the other thing we're doing when it comes to the Commonwealth Government security issuance is we are not raiding the Future Fund. So I ask those opposite, will they commit not to raid the Future Fund if they were ever elected to this side of the House, Mr Speaker? Will they say to this House, no, we will not see gross debt rise because we will not build the Western Sydney Airport, or we will not build the Inland Rail project, and we will not do any of this, Mr Speaker.
Has concluded. The member for Boothby has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the release of today's employment figures? How is the government's budget generating stronger economic growth to create more and better paid jobs?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She has a keen interest in economic issues in this parliament, and I thank her for her input to the government's strong economic plan, which is driving jobs and growth, Mr Speaker, because more than 50,000 Australians went out in May to seek a full-time job under the Turnbull government, and they got one, Mr Speaker. 50,000 Australians went out to get a job in May, and they got one under the economic policies of the Turnbull government. The unemployment rate now, Mr Speaker, has fallen to 5.5%, which is lower than what we inherited from the Labor Party back in 2013. And it's not just that. More Australians have expressed confidence in the Australian economy by going back in and joining the labour force, as we have seen the labour force participation rate rise to almost 65%. And it's not just that, Mr Speaker. Australian workers got more hours. Now, the Shadow Treasurer may not be interested in this, Mr Speaker. He's very quick to come out with commentary on a number that may not be as good. But when there's a good number, Mr Speaker, his back is turned to the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. His back is turned to Australian workers when they're getting more hours, when they're getting more jobs, when young people are finding jobs. The Labor Party's back is turned, and they say no in this parliament. They say no in this parliament to doing things that will grow our economy and ensure that those jobs and those wages can flow. And so we congratulate those Australians who went out and got those jobs in the month of May and the months leading up to May as well, Mr Speaker, as we saw employment growth lift. The rate of jobs growth has increased to 2% through the year. That is 10 times the level of jobs growth we saw under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. 10 times the level of jobs growth. The budget I handed down a month ago, Mr Speaker, was all about making the right choices to support more and better paid jobs. And that is what we need to do if we are not going to be complacent about securing the better days ahead. And what you know in the Australian economy is this. And when Australian businesses are providing Australians with jobs, they are expressing confidence in the future of the Australian economy. They can see those better opportunities and they are seeking to seize them. And I commend the Australian businesses who have been creating jobs for Australians in this country and giving their families the sort of sense of confidence and certainty that they can have. The Turnbull government is on the side of Australians who want to get a job and who want to create a job, Mr Speaker. And that's what these figures demonstrate today. The Labor Party, by contrast, is standing in the way of the Turnbull government's economic plans that will generate more and better paid jobs, seeking to play politics of opposition and the cynicism that defines this Leader of the Opposition.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tomorrow, for the first time in Australia's history, gross debt will crash through $500 billion. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Assistant Minister to the Treasurer, who said earlier today that under this government there is, and I quote, a truckload of debt and an absolutely extraordinary amount of debt?
The Prime Minister has
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Rankin for his question, because it gives us the opportunity to reflect on the work he did when he was working for the member for Lilly as Treasurer. He said to me, one of my colleagues have said he was the member for Lily's brain. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that's harsh. That reflects poorly on each of them, and so I dissociate myself from that member for Rankin. This is how Labor was responsible for running up that debt. Failed border protection policies, abandoning the security of our borders, $14 billion blowout. Yes? Member for Rankin was there.
The member for Rankin will cease interjecting.
A schools hall program wasted $8 billion. $8 billion. Another great idea that came out of the member for Lily's office. A pink bats program, $2.5 billion. Sending 16,000 stimulus checks to dead people, 27,000 Kevin Rudd stimulus checks to people living overseas. Laptops in schools, $1.5 billion blown out. Solar homes programs, $850 million blowout. Green loans program, $300 million wasted. It's a very long list. Labor ran up a huge debt, a structural deficit, and then leaving that to the coalition left us with the task of fixing it. And we are bringing the budget back into balance. And we are genuinely doing that. Unlike the Labor Party that always claimed they were hitting a surplus. Indeed, it's only a few years ago that the Leader of the Opposition on the ABC in 2011 said, I look at the rigour with which the Treasurer, the Prime Minister, indeed the Cabinet, approached getting the government budget into surplus. It wasn't very rigorous. I don't doubt that every day that is the guiding principle to push this government to make sure we're able to achieve being in surplus by 2012-13. Well, that's quite a long time ago, Mr. Speaker. Labor left us with debt and then on losing government have done everything they can to prevent us getting the budget back into balance. The Leader of the Opposition talks about tax cuts for millionaires. He loves that, the old champion of the poor and oppressed there, storming the barricades, sort of, one red flag flying. He's such a hero, of the people. But the reality is, why are we getting the budget back into balance? Because we're making tough decisions. Exactly. We're cutting spending. We are imposing a levy on the major banks, raising $6 billion, Mr. Speaker, over the forwards. We're raising that money. We're raising that money.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded.
Raising the money.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Just before I call the member for Melbourne, I'm pleased to inform the House we have in the gallery today the Attorney-General of New Zealand, the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, and the High Commissioner, His Excellency Mr Chris Seed. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you and to your delegation. The member for Melbourne has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Immigration. How many Coalition or Labor Party politicians or Liberal Party members, including but not limited to John Caputo, have approached you or the department to facilitate or inquire after the status of efforts by Wang Jiangmo to obtain Australian citizenship?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I asked for some work to be done in relation to the numbers of letters of support, for example, that have been provided by members of this House, anticipating perhaps a question of this nature. I haven't got a comprehensive list, and sadly I haven't included representations from the Greens, but it is the case for me as Immigration Minister, for all of my colleagues past in this portfolio, that we do receive a number of letters of support and special pleadings from members of parliament, because that's their job. Their job is to represent their constituents, and their constituents, particularly where they have difficulties around the nuance of a particular case, if there is a sick child, somebody who has an unnecessary bureaucratic burden in their way to move toward a permanent residency or a citizenship outcome. They might have a problem with a visa otherwise. And the honourable member may be interested to know that in terms of correspondence from MPs, in the period from 1 July 2016 to the close of business 14 June 2017, I received 2,875 such requests. In fact, since late October, in fact from October 2014, so just before I came into this portfolio, in total we've received about 7,500 requests. I can give some breakdown in terms of those opposite. For example, the very honourable, as I pointed out yesterday, member for McMahon, 183 letters of support from 2014 to current. For the member for Watson, 21 over that period. Member for Graindler, 25. And so some people, depending on their electorates, will have additional contributions to make because they have a higher proportion of people from different backgrounds and part of different communities that will make representations. I think that's entirely appropriate. It's as it should be, and I commend members for representing their constituents.
The member for Melbourne doesn't have the call. Has the minister concluded his answer? The minister has concluded his answer. The member for Tangney.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the minister update the House on steps the government is taking to strengthen the requirements for obtaining Australian citizenship? What are the benefits of having a strong and consistent approach to national security?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Well, Mr Speaker, I firstly want to say thank you very much to the member for Tangney for the work he's doing, not only in this place but in his electorate. In fact, he was one of the members today who came to see me on behalf of some of his constituents he was representing, and we were talking about the changes, the strengthening of the citizenship provisions, because we do believe it's important at this point in time that we modernise the citizenship arrangements in this country. We want to make sure that we provide citizenship to those people who are most deserving, who want to abide by Australian laws and by Australian values, those people that will want to work hard, those people that will want to send their kids to school and take the opportunity afforded to them by a new start in our country. And he, like all members in this House, applaud those 5 million people who since 1949 have taken up Australian citizenship to make our country the great country that it is today. So it is quite astounding, Mr Speaker, when the government puts forward changes to strengthen the citizenship arrangements in this country, that we have those opposite coming out in opposition to those very necessary changes. Now, I think there is a complete lack of leadership from the Leader of the Opposition, because he has at the moment various members from the left, presumably of the Labor Party, who are out there criticising what are sensible changes to strengthen the citizenship laws in this country. And you know what? Most of them are the same people that opposed us in relation to Operation Sovereign Borders, that is, stopping boats, stopping drownings at sea and getting children out of detention. It is quite amazing, but nonetheless not surprising, that this Leader of the Opposition didn't show the leadership then, and he is not showing the leadership now to pull those people into line. So why did Labor fail? Why did they allow 50,000 people in on 800 boats? Because this Leader of the Opposition doesn't have the mettle or the determination to be the leader of this country. That's the reality, Mr Speaker, and he is demonstrating it again today, because he has not had one word of criticism in relation to those that sit behind him that have come out to criticise. Now, there is a very special contributor to this debate. That is the member for Scullin. Now, not many people will know who he is, but he sits as far away from most of these people because, frankly, I suspect they're embarrassed by some of the comments that he's made. In relation to the citizenship changes, I see that he's tweeted, and I quote, that it's a shameful abdication of responsibility. What the government of the day making sure that we are allowing the right people to become citizens of this country. That's an abdication somehow of our responsibility. But he also said, Mr Speaker, as it turns out, at the ALP conference, and I quote him again, he says, listen to this in relation to debates. He says, I disagree with you when it comes to turnbacks, and I'll say very briefly why, comrades. I'm unconvinced by their effectiveness. You know, he is one of clueless many on the opposite side. He's off running around with these dangerous lines. This is what gets people smugglers back into business, these sort of irresponsible lines. And this Leader of the Opposition, if he is ever elected, the boats will restart.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call. The Leader of the Opposition just resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the member for Scullin made very unparliamentary remarks about the
members on my left will not interject.
And border protection, very unparliamentary remarks, and he should be required to withdraw them. And he wasn't in his seat when he was making them, either.
The member for Scullin.
I withdraw.
Thank the member for Scullin. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. It's reported today that the Business Council of Australia has said that if there isn't a clean energy target, what's the alternative? They've said that if Australia continues to do nothing, we will continue to pay higher prices and have a less secure electricity supply. Does the Prime Minister agree? And will the Prime Minister now commit to work with Labor in the national interest to end the policy paralysis which has led to higher electricity prices and instability in the energy market?
The member for Goldstein will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition smirk gave the bipartisanship away very eloquently. When he stands up and invites us to bipartisanship, it is smirking away. He can't even keep a straight face. Mr Speaker, he'd be well advised to stay out of poker games, I think, with a face like that. Mr Speaker, we have received a report from the Chief Scientist and his panel, and we thank him and the panel for it, and we are carefully considering it. But the fact of the matter is this, is that unlike the Labor Party, we are focused on ensuring that Australians have affordable and secure energy, electricity and gas, and that we meet our emissions reduction commitments. But, Mr Speaker, that's our commitment, that's our objective. The Labor Party, I hope, would agree with that, at least at a principle level. But what did they do about it? Nothing. In government, everything they've done and everything they've said in opposition is calculated to make energy less affordable and less reliable. Now, we know at the moment we are facing a genuine crisis on the east coast of Australia due to the shortage of gas. That has driven gas prices up. It's threatened tens of thousands of jobs in manufacturing industry, the jobs that the Leader of the Opposition claims to want to protect, threatening those jobs, and of course it has put upward pressure, very significant pressure, on wholesale electricity prices. Now, this has been caused by too much gas, or more gas being exported than can be done consistent with keeping the domestic markets supplied. All done under the Labor Party. And they were warned about it. They knew. In 2012, in their energy paper, it was stated expressly that the export deals from Queensland, which Labor approved, were going to put at risk the domestic market. And prices up. In the previous year, AEMO gave exactly the same warning about those deals. And so the Labor Party knew the risk they were taking when they licensed all those exports, and now it falls to us in the coalition to take the tough decisions to fix it. And by imposing the export controls that we will impose, that we foreshadowed and will impose, we have already seen a reduction in wholesale gas prices in the East Coast. We have secured supply of gas for peaking power during the summer. So we've done those things. We are taking the steps, the practical steps, grounded in economics and engineering, not ideological and partisan and political slogans. The hard work, the grind of government to get the job done, to secure Australians' energy and gas affordable, secure, while meeting our reduction emission commitments.
Just before I call the member for Banks, I would also like to welcome to the gallery this afternoon two members of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, the Honourable Ron Hounig, member for Heffron, and Mr Nick Lalick, member for Cabramatta. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you both, and I call the member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Justice and the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Counterterrorism. Will the Minister update the House on today's arrest of a man in relation to a counter-terrorism operation? What is the government doing to protect Australians from the threat of terrorism?
The Minister for Justice has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Banks for that question. And today the New South Wales Joint Counterterrorism Team has arrested a 20-year-old man at Sydney Airport for the alleged crime of attempting to travel to Syria to fight alongside the Islamic State. Now, once again, we're required to thank our law enforcement and intelligence community for the work that they do to keep Australians safe. This is another example of the close work done between the Commonwealth and the states. In this case, the New South Wales Joint Counterterrorism Team made up of the Australian Federal Police, ASIO and New South Wales Police. The man, a 22-year-old from Sydney South, is expected to be charged with preparations for a foreign incursion. This man had been under the watch of our law enforcement agencies for the past 5 months, and he was known, as is often the case, to our law enforcement agencies for other criminal matters. At this stage, it is believed that he has acted alone, self-radicalising online, but been in contact with terrorists overseas. The police have advised me that there is no current or impending threat to the Australian community. Because of this government's tougher terrorism laws, the penalty for this offence, for preparing to travel illegally to the conflict zone, is now life imprisonment. This is part of the 8 tranches of legislation that the government has passed to enhance our national security over the past 2 years. These law reforms give our agencies unprecedented power to prevent terrorist attacks. The arrest today is a reminder that we have a small group of radicalised people in Australia who continue to threaten our national security. Since 2012, around 200 Australians have travelled to the conflict zone in the Middle East. As many as 76 of these people have been killed, and through the reforms that we have made, the Australian Defence Force now has greater power to eliminate terrorists in the Middle East, whether they are involved in a combatant role or not. As part of a broad coalition, we are destroying ISIL in the Middle East. They are losing territory, they are losing money, and their soldiers are either being killed or are deserting. Domestically, we've invested $1.5 billion in the ability of our law enforcement and intelligence community to combat terrorism, most recently an extra $321 million to the Australian Federal Police in the budget that's just been brought down. But we need to continue to evolve our law enforcement response in relation to this threat of terrorism. And just last week in Hobart, the Prime Minister secured agreement from the states and territories to have a presumption against bail or parole for people who have supported or have links to terrorism. This government will remain at the forefront of our efforts to battle the evolving menace of terrorism, including travelling to Indonesia next month to deal with our regional counterparts on coordinating our counter-terrorism efforts in the region. Mr Speaker, we will continue to do whatever is required in conjunction with our agencies to keep the Australian people safe.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the government considering adopting a threshold that would subsidise new coal-fired power stations to be built under its clean energy target? Under this Prime Minister, is coal now clean energy? As a matter of government policy, are there any forms of energy that are not considered clean energy?
The member for Mackellar will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question on the subject of coal. And it gives me the opportunity of recalling some memorable remarks by her leader, the member for Maribyrnong, who said on the ABC some years back, "We're going to keep a coal industry." Oh! For some people who believe the way to solve climate change is to shut down coal, that answer's not going to give you any joy at all. Oh! Doesn't seem to be giving the member for Sydney any joy. The member for Maribyrnong went on. We're also supporting clean coal technology. And whilst people have got fierce and competing ideas
the member for Maribyrnong observes, showing, Mr Speaker, he has the makings of a geologist, he says Australia does have a lot of coal. And so,
Members on
just
my right.
simply saying we're not going to dig that up anymore as of tomorrow isn't the way to run the economy. It is, however, apparently the way to run the Labor Party. Mr Speaker, the honourable member's question completely fails to understand the objective of the government's energy policy. It is, as I have said, to ensure that energy is affordable, that it's secure, reliable, and that we meet our emission reduction commitments, addressing the trilemma. As far as ensuring that it is secure and affordable, we need to have an all-of-the-above approach. As I said at the Press Club at the beginning of the year, and as Labor member after Labor member, and there's a long list with quotes similar to those I just read out, coal will be part of Australia's and the world's energy mix for many, many years to come. In fact, Penny Wong, accurately quoting the International Energy Agency, said some years back it'll be part of the world's mix, playing a big role until past the 2050s. And she's right. She's absolutely right. And they made a great commitment to carbon capture and storage, which now apparently they've abandoned. The important thing is to get the mix right to ensure that energy is affordable. Now, we are making the biggest commitment to pump hydro, which makes renewables reliable, I should add, for the benefit of the member of Sydney, in Australia's history. That's our initiative. That's our commitment. That is the leadership we are providing to ensure Australia's energy future. Labor has ideology. It's got politics. It's got slogans. It's got partisanship. It's even got fake offers of bipartisanship. But what it doesn't have is a plan, because it ignores economics, it ignores engineering. And finally, I'd remind the member for Sydney, that if you want to meet your emissions reduction obligations, you've got to reduce emissions. How you do that, of course, is of less concern than meeting the commitment.
Concluded. The member for Gilmore.
For Foreign Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of maintaining public trust and confidence in our government's management of national security issues? Is the Minister aware of other approaches that may have different outcomes?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Gilmore for her question. And it should be evident that the standing and legitimacy of democratic governments depends to the extent that its ministers can advance the national interest without fear or favour. And the Turnbull government has single-mindedly advanced Australia's national interest, including through clear
Member for Jellybrand is warned.
Clear and consistent foreign policy. And I do draw the contrast with the Labor Party's approach and the examples we've seen in recent times, where the Labor Party, at the behest of personal benefactors or foreign states, have changed long-standing foreign policy positions without explanation. Indeed, we have the infamous example of Senator Sam Dastyari at his press conference, where he was publicly contradicting both government and opposition policy.
The Minister for Foreign Affairs will resume her seats. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, you gave a clear direction yesterday on members being referred to by their title. The Treasurer was the person you gave that warning to yesterday. He's just made the exact same comment and is trying to say that because it wasn't from the dispatch box, he's somehow not within the
Manager
Parliament.
of Opposition Business will resume his seat. I'll address this matter. Members need to refer to other members and senators by their correct titles. That's true. All interjections are disorderly, and I don't like them at all. They come from all parts of the chamber. They do. And unfortunately, those interjections make it to Hansard when attention's drawn to them. If I was picking up every interjection, you wouldn't get through many questions. And they did not have the call. The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I was referring to the infamous example of Senator Sam Dastyari, who publicly contradicted both government and opposition long-standing foreign policy on the South China Sea at the behest of his personal benefactor. Mr Speaker, we've now learned that the member for Hunter,
the Minister
for Defence and a member of the National Security Committee of a Labor government had a personal benefactor whom it is alleged had close links with the Chinese intelligence service. And Mr Speaker, that now brings to mind a very disturbing incident that occurred when Labor did a sudden about-face on an important foreign policy position and abruptly announced Australia's withdrawal from a quadrilateral security dialogue between Australia, the United States, Japan and India at the behest of China. And it begs the question, what role did the member for Hunter play as a member of the National Security Committee and the Minister for Defence in that extraordinary about-face and backflip on the part of the Labor government with no explanation? But, Mr Speaker, it gets murkier, because earlier, I think it was last week, the Fairfax media put a series of questions to the member for Hunter, and in response he said, unequivocally, quote, "I have never written to a Chinese official," end quote. That's what he said. Now, I would invite the member for Hunter to repeat that statement in this House, but then how would he explain his sworn affidavit to the ACT Supreme Court where he lists letter after letter from the member for Hunter to various Chinese officials, members of the Politburo, senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, governors and vice-governors? What is it, member for Hunter? No correspondence with Chinese officials or letter after letter. And it is this kind
The minister's time has concluded.
It's this kind of...
The member for Burt.
My question is to the Foreign Minister. Yesterday in question time, when asked about the Julie Bishop Glorious Foundation, which had been established by one of the Liberal Party's biggest donors, mining magnate Sally Zhao, the minister said that she had never stood next to a Chinese benefactor. Does the minister stand by that answer? Is the fact that there are photos of her standing next to Chinese benefactors just another coincidence? Just like how we were told yesterday, the naming of the Julie Bishop Glorious Foundation had nothing to do with her and was just a coincidence.
Members on my right, the Minister for Foreign Affairs has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, if one thing's for certain, the word glorious will never be in the same sentence as the name of the member for Perth.
Members on my right.
Mr Speaker, what is disturbing about this question is that it goes to show that Labor has no understanding of the difference between attending a Chinese banquet and lining up for selfie or photo after photo after photo, and I assume that members opposite are asked for photographs at banquets and public events, I'm assuming. There's a vast difference between standing and having your photograph taken, whether it's at a public event or a Chinese banquet or walking through the airport, and standing at the Commonwealth parliamentary offices in Sydney with the Australian flag behind you, at a lectern with the Commonwealth coat of arms, and publicly, in the presence of your personal benefactor, publicly opposing long-standing foreign policy of both the opposition and the government. And the fact that Labor cannot tell the difference goes to show why we have such a national security crisis in the Labor ranks. There is no public confidence in the Labor Party until such time as Senator Sam Dastyari and the member for Hunter are called upon by the Leader of the Opposition to explain their circumstances.
The member for Canning.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. Will the minister outline to the House why it is important for employer and employee organisations to act in a way that promotes transparency and manages the potential for conflict of interest? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his very important question. Yesterday in the House, Mr Speaker, I referred to a $27,500 payment made from Australian Super to the AWU in 2006-07, when the Leader of the Opposition was both the National Secretary of the AWU as well as being a member of the Board of Australian Super. The Leader of the Opposition made a personal explanation after question time in which he stated that no conflict existed. But I can reveal, Mr Speaker, that the APRA rules state quite clearly that a director who is nominated by a different body, in other words a union, to the superannuation fund has the strong possibility of a conflict between the interests of beneficiaries and the interests of the nominating or appointing body, and the director must avoid, if not manage, any resulting actual or perceived conflict, Mr Speaker. So, in other words, being a member of the board and the National Secretary of the AWU was, under the law, a conflict of interest that needed to be managed. So the Leader of the Opposition was badly advised yesterday and should correct the record in this House that he did in fact have a conflict of interest. But the substantive issue remains, Mr Speaker, that when Australian Super gave $27,500 to the AWU, did the Leader of the Opposition take any steps to manage his conflict of interest? Did he, for example, disclose a conflict of interest? Did he disqualify himself, participate in the deliberations when he shouldn't have, or did he act in his own interests in preference to the interests of the beneficiaries of the superannuation entity? Because they are the tests required under the APRA guidelines. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is very quick to demand that the Prime Minister stand up in the House and explain his financial arrangements since he's being a Member of Parliament, and the Prime Minister has never hesitated to do so. He has stood up and taken the House and the press gallery through his financial arrangements that proves that he does not have a conflict of interest. So the Leader of the Opposition has a responsibility, if what's good for the goose is good for the gander, to explain to the press gallery and to this House how he managed his conflict of interest as National Secretary of the AWU and a Director of Australian Super. Because if he doesn't do so, in the end it goes to his character. Not only did he sell out the workers at Clean Event, not only did he sell out the workers at Chiquita Mushrooms, but he's also sold out the beneficiaries of the Australian Super Fund. He needs to explain his position.
The member for Blaxland.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Media reports state a trust linked to a Chinese donor made a $50,000 donation to former Trade and Investment Minister Andrew Robb's fundraising vehicle, the Bayside Forum, on the exact same day Mr Robb finalised the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Does the Prime Minister seriously expect the Australian people to believe that it was just a coincidence that a Chinese donor paid $50,000 to Mr Robb's fundraising vehicle on the exact same day he finalised the China FTA?
The Leader of the House on a point
Mr
of order.
Speaker, I simply ask you the question, how is this within the responsibility of the Prime Minister? He wasn't asked a question—
No, members on my left.
The Prime Minister wasn't asked a question about the Ministerial Code of Conduct. He was asked an entirely separate question that doesn't bear on his responsibilities whatsoever.
Does the Manager of Opposition Business wish to make a contribution?
Yeah, I do, Mr Speaker. The question goes to the free trade agreement.
No, the Leader of the House has had his say. He'll now listen in silence. The Manager of Opposition Business.
The question goes directly to the free trade agreement, a major agreement signed between Australia and China, and the circumstances under which it was signed. That's what the question goes very directly to, and the motivations of the government at that time.
I'll listen to the question very carefully, and yesterday I made it very clear that questions needed to go to the Prime Minister's direct responsibility. I do appreciate the point the Manager of Opposition Business makes about the China Free Trade Agreement, but the question didn't go to the Prime Minister's responsibilities. Ultimately, the question was about whether this was a coincidence or not, and that's just, I think, a fishing trip that means it's out of order on this occasion. The member for Durack.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. Will the minister update the House on the release of the Productivity Commission review of the National Disability Insurance Scheme costs? Why, more than ever, is it important that the National Disability Insurance Scheme is fully funded, and is the minister aware of any alternatives?
The Minister for Social Services.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and for her interest in this area. And as the member is aware, there were three very important events that occurred in the development of the NDIS this week. The first event was that there was a very strong delegation of disability advocates. They came here to try and persuade the Labor Party to fully fund the NDIS. What John Della Bosca from Every Australian Counts said was this: the increase in the Medicare levy must happen in order to secure a consistent, sustainable funding stream for the NDIS. That's what we are telling everybody, and that's what we will keep telling everybody until we get a result. The second very important event was, as was noted, the Productivity Commission interim report into the NDIS. And that interim report asked and answered a very critical question, which is the rollout of the NDIS on track and within budget? And it concluded that it is. The third very important event, Mr Speaker, this week, and possibly the most remarkable event, in fact, as far as I'm aware, it is an astonishing development totally without precedent, and that is a press release from the member for Jagga Jagga, which is not entirely 100% negative in its appraisal of the government. Members, it is utterly true. I can table it if needs be. The press release is actually entitled NDIS on track. It then goes on to say the Productivity Commission has found that the NDIS is broadly on track. So what a remarkable event. I'm asked about alternatives, and sadly the remarkable event stopped there. What we don't have is the Labor Party on track for fully funding the NDIS. And when the Leader of the Opposition was asked about divisions in his shadow cabinet with respect to the 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy, what he said was, "We are all on the same page." Now, I find that claim vague and unconvincing, and it's worth some scrutiny. In 2013, the entirety of Labor thought it was fair. In 2017, three-quarters of the shadow cabinet still think it's the fairest way to fund the NDIS. The Leader of the Opposition is one of the few in shadow cabinet that opposes the increase as unfair, although he previously argued it was fair, and the Shadow Treasurer agrees to a full increase in the Medicare levy but does not want the money spent on the NDIS. So they're all on the same page. I'm reliably informed, Mr Speaker, that the largest piece of paper ever created in the world was created by students in Paraguay on 7 August 2015. That measured 15 metres by 10 metres, so about half a basketball court. So I guess maybe if that's the paper we're talking about, then Labor are all on that same massive page. But the fact is, Mr Speaker, the big problem is whatever page Labor are on, it is the wrong page. What each and every one of the disability advocates want who visited Parliament House this week, what they've all asked for, what they all seek to convince Labor of, is to get off the page that says that you will not fully fund the NDIS and get on the page that say that you actually care about the future of Australians with a disability and fully fund this scheme.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Blaxland.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the bid by the Chinese company Landbridge to operate the Port of Darwin. I also refer to the fact that subsequently Landbridge gave the former Minister for Trade, Andrew Robb, a part-time position paying $880,000 a year. Has he asked his department to investigate whether there's a link between these two events, and has he asked them to investigate whether there's been any breach of the Ministerial Code of Conduct?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have discussed these matters with the Secretary of my department, Dr Parkinson, and he confirmed that in a letter dated today to me, which reads, and I'll table this: as you know, I've twice discussed with Mr Andrew Robb the obligations placed on former ministers by the Statement of Ministerial Standards on both occasions, 28 February and 31 May 2017. Mr Robb assured me he fully understands the obligations of the statement. He's also assured me he's complied with the statement, in particular para 2.24, in terms of his post-cabinet and post-parliament activities, and has reiterated that commitment in writing on the 1st of June 2017, and I'll table that letter.
That's the sort of answer we want.
The member for Maranoa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House the steps the government is taking to grow the economy through investments in the agricultural sector? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any barriers to unlocking the potential for the agricultural sector, particularly in my home state, Queensland?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question and thank the honourable member for the honourable way that he conducts his job in his electorate and how hard he works for his electorate. So hard that he's, in regards to pest control, I know out in the Paroo, 2,563 kilometres of fencing, bringing back the sheep industry, making sure that we get the benefits of the employment in places like Cunnamulla. I want to thank the honourable member for the hard work he's doing in the mobile black spot program with 35 new and upgraded mobile phone towers and how he continues to work so diligently for his electorate. I want to thank him also for the work he's doing with the Bridges Renewal program and the $2.5 million to replace the Lemon Tree Bostock Road Bridge. All the roads to recovery with the $35.6 million for councils such as my old council of Boulogne and Barcaldine and Bulu and Longreach. All the work he's doing with the Community Grants program to making sure that we get the Waltzing Matilda Centre up and running again. These are all part of delivery that also goes hand in glove with the infrastructure requirements to build a stronger agricultural sector. And right now he's working with so many others for the Inland Rail, the $8,400 million project, Inland Rail, a corridor of commerce which will connect the seat of Maranoa to Victoria through Western New South Wales. This is incredibly hard work. And as recently as yesterday, he's been in my office with the Minister for Transport, making sure that this project is completed and completed soon, so we can get that agricultural product moving. Products such as cotton, such as beef, such as coal. And it's very important that we move products such as coal because that's how we actually balance the books and how we make money. It's the budget in Queensland the other day. It was interesting to note they were spruiking their budget surplus because there was an extra $1.5 billion came from coal royalties, an extra $1.5 billion came from coal royalties, in excess of $3 billion for royalties all up. And it's very important that because we believe that there's a capacity for us to use these resources that we always have to make sure that we fix our power problems, because power is a big issue in the agricultural sector. And I was listening to the Prime Minister before and he was talking about peaking power. For a moment there I thought he was talking about the Labor Party front bench. And it was very important that we make sure that we keep the capacity to keep power affordable. It'd be interesting if the member for Shortland was interested in making sure that the coal industry kept going, that he supported the coal miners in the Hunter Valley. Instead of yawning, he should be supporting them. He should be standing up for them, standing up for those coal miners, standing up for those AWU workers, standing up for those CFMEU workers. Be interesting to see if the member for Hunter wants to stand up for the coal miners in the Hunter Valley. I suppose he might. You got the member for Shortland, but the member for Shortland just sits there. He used to say so much, but now he's gone mute. He's gone quiet. He's gone quiet. He's gone quiet on his people. He's gone quiet on his people. Just doesn't have the ticket to stand up. But what we are going to do is continue to turn around the agricultural sector. We've had the biggest turnaround in the history of our nation in this sector, bringing real wealth back to our nation.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to my questions to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's answer to the member for Sydney. Is the Prime Minister aware that modelling in the Fiscal report concludes that no new coal-fired power stations will be built under a clean energy target? And the Chief Scientist has said about new coal-fired power stations, and I quote, "It would be surprising if governments were to endorse a scheme that incentivised them." Does the Prime Minister agree with the Chief Scientist?
The Minister for Transport won't interject. The Minister for the Environment and
Thank you. I thank the member for Port Adelaide for his question, and he knows that Dr Finkel and his expert panel have produced a comprehensive report, and in that report their preference is for the clean energy target over the Labor Party's emissions intensity scheme, and the reason why is because it will lower prices more than an EIS would. And he also makes it very clear that when it comes to coal, under the clean energy target, it will stay in the system longer, and that by creating a level of regulatory certainty, you're more likely, as an existing coal operator, to be able to go to your financiers and get the money to do an upgrade or the maintenance that is required, Mr Speaker. Now, the Chief Scientist was asked, could a new coal-fired power station be built? And he said, absolutely, it's conceivable it could be built. And that is the key point. The market will determine these matters. But the Labor Party is in denial. about the importance of coal as a form of baseline power. It might be surprising for them to know that in South Australia, when the Northern Power Station closed and you lost all the coal-fired power in South Australia, prices went up and the system became less stable because the Premier of South Australia, Jay Weatherill, was conducting a big experiment. And in the member for Port Adelaide's own electorate, Adelaide Brighton, employing 450 people, lost its power for 36 hours. So what does the member for Port Adelaide say to the 450 workers in his own electorate? He doesn't want to answer that question. He doesn't want to take responsibility for his left-wing caucus mate, the Premier of South Australia. Now, the reality is, under the Prime Minister's leadership, we have put storage front and centre on the government's agenda. Our announcement around Snowy Hydro 2.0, the work that the Australian National University is doing to map out other pumped hydro facilities throughout the country, what we did in Tasmania and the work that we are doing there to investigate, again, hydro facilities and expansion in Tasmania, which will be of great help in providing a battery to the mainland. The work we're doing with ARENA and Cultana in South Australia, in the Upper Spencer Gulf. The work we're doing to create a virtual power plant throughout South Australia, 1,000 homes and businesses connected in order to provide battery storage. This is what the coalition is doing. Our primary objective is the stability of the system, so we don't see a repeat of the madness that occurred under the Labor Party. And our other key objective is affordability, because we, on this side of the House, care about jobs and investment, unlike the reckless Labor Party.
The member for Forrest.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on how the government is taking a technology-neutral approach to energy policy that will allow carbon capture and storage to play a bigger role in the transition to a lower emissions future? Is the minister aware of any obstacles?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Forrest for her question and know that she is very concerned about the future of industry in the southwest of her state. And she's concerned not only about the affordability of power, but also its sustainability and ensuring that it is low emissions technology. That is why she and other coalition members on this side of the House welcome our announcement that we are seeking to amend the legislation of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to enable it to invest in carbon capture and storage. Because back in 2011-2012 there was a political fix, and the political fix was between the Labor Party and their alliance partners in the Greens. And they ruled out carbon capture and storage as one of the prohibited technologies that could be funded under the CEFC. This is despite the fact that the International Energy Agency says it's not optional when it comes to reducing emissions to rule out CCS. This is despite the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change saying the cost of meeting Paris commitments would be double if you didn't have CCS. This is despite the fact that you can get a 90% emissions reduction by using CCS, not just for thermal generation, gas and coal, but also importantly for industrial processes, chemicals, steel, cement. That's why the Coalition's announcement was welcomed by the likes of BHP, BlueScope, the Business Council of Australia, Energy Networks Australia, Shell, and indeed it was entirely consistent with the former comments of the member for Coria and the member for McMahon and the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate and the member for Lilly and indeed the member for Port Adelaide.
Members on my
members
right,
opposite had supported carbon
members on my
capture and
right will
storage.
cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business.
On your earlier ruling where you drew attention to all interjections being disorderly and about members being referred to on by their title, the Treasurer has just done the exact same thing
The Manager
in
of Opposition
defiance of
Business
your ruling,
will
and he
resume
knows
his
he's in
seat.
defiance.
I just urge the Manager of Opposition Business, if he'd like, given it's Thursday and with 5 minutes to go, to perhaps just with respect review everything I said when I addressed his last point of order. But I do again say to members interjecting, all interjections are disorderly and they should bear that in mind, particularly when it comes to referring to members by their correct titles. The Minister has the call.
So the Labor Party went to the Australian people in 2016 ahead of the election with a specific policy proposal which was to broaden the investment of the CEFC. The member for Port Adelaide went to the Press Club and said he wanted to get rid of the ridiculous restrictions on the mandate of the CEFC. So you can imagine our surprise when the Labor Party announced that it would not support our legislative change to the CEFC. So we know that the Labor Party will say one thing. It doesn't matter if it's on company tax. It doesn't matter if it's on the Medicare levy. It doesn't matter if it's on Gonski school funding. And now it doesn't matter if it's on energy policy. They will say one thing to the Australian people and do another thing in this place, Mr Speaker. We all know on this side of the House, when it comes to hypocrisy, thy name is Labor.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Fiscal review concluded that a clean energy target accompanied by other reforms would lower prices, lower emissions and ensure reliability without new coal power stations. But it's reported today that the government's considering throwing more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money at a new coal-fired power station. How can the Prime Minister possibly justify throwing $1 billion of taxpayers' money at a new coal-fired power station?
The Minister for Energy and the Environment.
Keep it short, though. We might as well.
Well, we know that the member for Lilly supports coal because he commissioned a report into a new coal-fired power station in northern Queensland. The member for Lilly, the second most famous boy to come out of Nambour High, Mr Speaker. The second most famous graduate out of Nambour High. He commissioned... The Treasurer of the Millennia. the Treasurer of the Millennia. And Euromoney's Treasurer of the Year. Mr Speaker, the reality is, when it comes to coal, it's a critical part of our energy mix. And the Leader of the Opposition said this in 2007. We believe completely that coal is part of Australia's energy future. We also need to be at the forefront of ensuring that the processes which we adopt to use coal are as clean and as efficient as can possibly be made, Mr Speaker. So the reality is, under the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, we want an energy mix which is technology neutral, which is focused on the trilemma of affordability, stability and meeting our international commitments. Only we on this side of the House can do that, and only Labor will drive up electricity prices and lead to a more unstable electricity system.
Yeah. The member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, representing the Minister for Communications. Will the minister update the House on steps the government is taking to protect local jobs in the media industry, particularly in regional Australia, and are there any alternative approaches?
Yeah. The Minister for Urban Infrastructure has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Wide Bay, who fights very strongly for his electorate. He fights very strongly for regional jobs in Wide Bay and all around regional Australia, because he knows that the coalition stands up for regional and rural and remote Australia, whereas Labor is completely indifferent to regional and rural and remote Australia. The Turnbull government is fighting to protect jobs in the media industry, and that's why the Turnbull government has today introduced into parliament legislation to give effect to our comprehensive media reform package. The Australian media business, Mr Speaker, is exposed to fierce competition from global media players and from social media giants thanks to internet-driven disruption. And these huge global companies, Mr Speaker, are not subject to arcane, out-of-date restrictions like the 2 out of 3 rule and the 75% audience reach rule. Australian industry players want to respond, but they are blocked by arcane laws and by Labor's head-in-the-sand attitude. What is it that the chief executives of the regional broadcasters have to say? This is a joint comment from the chief executives of 3 regional broadcasters, Prime, Win and Southern Cross Austereo. They say, surely the evidence is clear. We doubt there is a politician in Canberra who wants to say they presided over an outdated regulatory regime that held back regional media. Well, Mr Speaker, there is a politician in Canberra who apparently wants to say exactly that, the Shadow Minister for Communications, who is continuing to argue for the retention of the outdated 2 out of 3 rule. Never mind the rise of global internet-based competition. She doesn't care about that. She put out a media release yesterday saying that to date Labor's Shadow Communications Minister has not received a briefing, curiously referring to herself in the third person, which always raises suspicion. She said not once in over a year has the minister consulted with Labor. She criticises Senator Fifield. She criticised Senator Fifield, the minister, for referring to the fact that 1,400 jobs at the 10 network are at risk. Well, I've got news for the Shadow Minister. It's not about you. It's about 1,400 jobs at 10 that are at risk. It's about jobs in regional Australia that are at risk. It's about the Turnbull government's plan to protect jobs in regional Australia in the media sector. We have a plan because we care about jobs, we care about people in regional Australia, we care about a diverse, active, vigorous media sector, an important part of our democracy, an important part of our society. The Turnbull government has a plan. Labor needs to get its head out of the sand, realise that times have changed and support our legislation.
Yeah. The Prime Minister has the call.
I ask that further questions be placed on the
I thank the Prime Minister.